Hi, everyone. This is Sam Silverman, Managing Partner of EB-5 Thank you for taking time to join us on today's webinar. Today, we're going to be chatting about policy guidance on investment term and how this affects EB-5 investors who are considering making a new EB-5 investment. USCIS recently announced a clarification on the minimum period of time that funds need to be invested. And so we're going to talk about the implications of that policy and how investors should be thinking about making a decision to invest in a project given this new information. A little bit of background about EB-5 We're a leading investment fund manager. We've worked with thousands of investors over the years, all around the world. This is a little map showing where many of our investors have come from over the years. We're also the only regional center operator to cover the entire continental United States, so we can do projects in pretty much every place across the country. A little bit more about my background and bio is here on the left side, and my partner Mike Schoenfeld there on the right. Short agenda about today. First, we're going to hear from our guest panelist, Bruce Rossetto, partner at Greenberg Traurig, and then we're going to dive into details about the policy, changes to be aware of, things investors should consider, and then we'll talk a little bit about a couple of current EB-5 projects. So first, I'll let Bruce jump in and introduce himself and share a little bit about Greenberg, and then we'll get into the meat of the presentation.
Well, thank you, Sam. I appreciate this opportunity, and welcome everybody. So I am a shareholder with Greenberg Traurig. Greenberg Traurig is an international law firm. We have 45 offices, about 2,650 lawyers, and I specialize in corporate securities and transactional work. Have been doing significant amount in the EB-5 arena since about 15 years ago, so I have very broad experience in that sector. I represent private equity funds, family offices, and a myriad of development companies and portfolio companies throughout the country.
Great. Thanks, Bruce. Okay, so Bruce, do you want to kind of set the stage for us and give us a little bit of context about what this policy change was and kind of why it's important, and how investors should just be thinking about this policy? What does it mean, and how does it impact someone who's considering joining a project now that this guidance is out there?
Yeah, thank you. And obviously, we're going to be talking in detail about this new policy throughout this webinar today. It derives from October 11, 2023, when the USCIS published some new guidance, and I want to emphasize the word guidance here. It's not a rule, relating to the EB-5 Reform and Integrity Act of 2022. Under this new USCIS guidance, investors who have EB-5 investors who have invested their capital after March of 2022 can now be repaid their investment capital after it has been invested and at risk for 2 years. We're going to talk a lot more during this webinar about what that really means, because as it appears to be straightforward, it's really not. And the guidance is going to be subject to certain interpretations. It leaves open many new questions. So we'll do our best to try and provide some background for that today, but not sure that we'll be able to unfortunately answer all the questions that I think that are opened up by this new policy.
Yep, exactly. So one of the first questions that we'll try and provide some color on is the starting of this 2-year period. So maybe to help provide a contrast, Bruce, maybe let's talk a little bit about what the rule was before this guidance came out.
Well, prior to this guidance, the 2-year period really was a conditional residency period of time, and that really caused, I guess, a delay in when EB-5 investors could expect to have the timing of their capital repaid. Under the new interpretation, the start date of this 2-year period, and we're now calling it a sustainment period, really begins to look at 2 things. Is the money at risk? And we'll have to discuss what at risk means. And of course, when the jobs are created, we still have to create 10 jobs, just like under the old rule. So there's some ambiguity as we look at this this new language under the statute. Being at risk seems to implicate that it's when the NCE gives the money to the JCE. The JCE is the entity that is developing the jobs and creating the construction project, right? And so the timing of when the JCE may need that money may be much later than when the EB-5 investor gives that money to the NCE. So there's really not a clear start date, if you will, for when that 2-year sustainment period is going to begin. But this is be something that we might require further guidance from the USCIS on as we move forward.
Got it. Okay. And if an investor wants to kind of, get familiar with this, they can just go to the USCIS website, right? All of this is published directly on the government site.
Yes, they certainly can, but they probably have some of the same difficulties on interpretation as we lawyers do.
Right. So let's talk about the investment period. So one of the questions and answers that they've published talks about kind of minimum, maximum, period of time. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think your headline on this slide does this a lot of justice, right? So the 2-year investment term is a minimum. It's not a maximum. There is no maximum time really under the rules. So the EB-5 investors are not going to be able to receive a return of their investment capital back until the minimum investment term, being the 2 years, is met, and the project has created the 10 jobs that are necessary. As I indicated, as we were discussing the last slide, this time frame is not really clear at this point. It does not mean that from a practical perspective that an investor is going to say, oh, there's this new sustainment period, I'm going to be able to get my money back in 2 years. As I think the investors will learn as we go through this webinar, is there going to be a lot of practical implications to how this gets applied. The developer may be able to pay back at the end of the 2-year period, but many times not. It's going to depend on things like what their senior loans might say. That might depend on the stabilization of their own project, and other factors that can come into play that can cause construction delays or what have you. Because at the end of the day, you need the 2-year minimum period, but you also need to make sure that the jobs are being created and that the money was always at risk during that period of time.
Got it. Okay, that makes sense. Let's talk a little bit about job creation. So one of the requirements, obviously, of the program itself is to create new jobs. So what is the government kind of thinking, in terms of the timing of this job creation and how that intersects with money, being invested?
So in terms of the job creation, it is absolutely critical that the jobs be created during the minimum 2-year investment period. Otherwise, the investor's capital is not going to be returned. Here, and I think we'll discuss this a little bit more in the webinar as we proceed, the timing of when those jobs are created are going to be mostly up to the developer and whether or not his construction funding is in place when he desires it to be in place, whether there's no delays because of weather, other problems that could inhibit supply chain problems, as an example, that can inhibit the construction project. And of course, as I mentioned, whatever the senior loan says in terms of its ability to be able to be repaid to a junior investor, to the senior lender. So, as we move forward and think about this, what we're trying to put in the mind frame of the investor is they need to really examine the projects very closely. They need to do good due diligence. And they need to get comfortable that sufficient jobs are going to be created. Either they've already been created because some projects may have already started construction, or will be created during their first 2 years of that investment. If the project is not going to be providing that type of comfort to you as an investor, then you may want to be looking at other projects. So this is going to be a critical point in when you as an investor might realistically expect to see a return on your capital investment.
Got it. Okay, that makes sense. So ultimately, the term is going to be defined by the particular NCE that the investor selects.
Well, the NCE, and then you have to drill down to the JECE to see what the project plans are from the JCE, right? Because
Right.
it rolls down.
Right. Got it. Okay. So let's talk about a couple of these kind of job creation issues and questions. In your mind, what are some of the most important ones that you want to focus in on if you're representing an investor who's looking at a few different projects? Like what are kind of the main ones you wanna understand?
So if I'm representing the investor, one of the first things I want to look at is what phase of development the project is in. If it's a completely new project and shovels aren't in the ground yet, or the entitlements haven't been received from the municipalities, that increases obviously the risk to the investor that they're going to see a return of their capital, perhaps ever. So I want to know what phase they're in. Have they started construction? Do they have funding in place? We look for projects ideally that can have comfort that the project's going to be completed because they have all the funding in place, meaning the senior debt, the equity from the developer, perhaps other means of financing in place to ensure that that project is going to be completed and developed on a timely basis with a developer that has experience in whatever sector of the market they're developing in, right? So I want to do background on the project. I want to do background on the development, and I want to understand the construction phases before I can recommend to an EB-5 investor that they should be risking their capital in this investment. At that point, it's up to the investor to determine what their comfort level is. I can only provide certain guidance in terms of what I've seen in past experience that may help them perhaps ameliorate the risks that are normally involved in such projects.
Got it. Okay, that makes sense. Okay, let's talk for a few minutes about repayment timing issues. So, again, putting on the perspective of, representing an investor, and, the investor says, well, how do I make sure the money comes back, in a reasonable period of time while also achieving the immigration goals? What are some of the kind of main things you want to kind of focus in on in terms of, money coming back from the project?
Well, in addition to what I just mentioned in terms of reviewing, where they are in the construction phases, I'm going to want to understand, looking at the offering docs that are being presented to the investor, what the JCE's plan is for repayment to the NCE, and then understand how the NCE plans to distribute that money to the EB-5 investors. So as this slide points out, there could be first in, first out mechanics, but there may not be. So the fact that you are one of the initial investors doesn't mean that you're going to be the first money out necessarily, right? So we need to look at the offering documents carefully. I really want to focus on what the waterfall for repayment is as between senior debt, mezzanine debt, and equity. We need to get comfortable. There are no prohibitions in the senior loan documents that might prohibit the repayment of any EB-5 investor's capital prior to a senior lender getting their capital back. We will need to, of course, understand, and oh, by the way, this all assumes that we're talking about investors that are coming in subsequent to March 2022, right? Because if they invested their money prior to March 2022, then this concept of the 2-year sustainment period isn't going to apply. They're still going to be governed by the old rules. So we're really focused right now, I think, on just talking about folks that invest subsequent to March 2022. When we look at the repayment timing issues, once we establish whether or not there's going to be senior debt or other covenants that might impede the ability of the JCE to repay the $800,000 back to the NC, so the NC can then pay it back to the investor. We want to take a look at the quality of the contractor. We want to look at the stage of development, whether they've already created jobs or what their anticipation of job creation is over the next 2-year period. As we assess those, then we have a better idea of when an investor can realistically expect to be repaid, if at all. Depending upon the risk level of some projects, it may be difficult for an investor to ever, recapture their investment dollars. So that, again, this goes back to my comment earlier that a lot of due diligence needs to be done here, and you shouldn't be just taking, at face value what some salesperson may have told you, right? So we want to look at the history of the developer as well as the status of the project, if you will.
Got it. So successful kind of execution track record is really critical.
Extremely critical. And part of the timing, and I think we said this earlier, Sam, part of the timing also goes back to when the JCE needs the money, because the fact that the investor puts the money in to the NCE today doesn't mean that the JCE needs money today. They may not need the money for 3, 4, 5, 6 months from now, right? In terms of what their own timing is based upon their construction phases. So that needs to be analyzed as part of all of this to have a better understanding of what the reality of the return of the capital is, as opposed to what it may appear on a piece of paper. If that makes sense.
Yep. That's pretty clear. Okay, so and we just mentioned that briefly a little bit earlier, but post RIA versus pre RIA. Let's hit those points quickly again. So if you're pre RIA, if you invested before March of 22, then this policy guidance does not impact you at all. And
Correct.
Your funds need to remain invested until you've held the green card, the conditional green card, for 2 years. So
which may, Sam, not to interrupt, but may mean for those folks that they're still going to be tied into that redeployment of their capital into another project.
Right, exactly. And for the post RIA, which we just talked through, that's where this change is applicable and where the at-risk period is likely going to be shorter. But you still need to meet the requirement of funds being invested at risk and being able to demonstrate that there's been sufficient job creation while the funds were invested. Okay, so just to kind of visually illustrate this, this is just an example for an investor in a rural project. We see here, the temporary green card period, and then the difference in repayment timeline, right? So if we're looking at after the clarification on the bottom, we can see, okay, once the money's really been in there for 2 years, then the investment can be returned. Whereas before this clarification came out, the investor, had to wait, let's say, about a year to get the conditional green card, and then they had to hold it for 2 years before the investment could be returned. So we can see that, the earliest that it could be returned is a year difference in this illustrative example under the new policy. But if we draw our attention to the bottom, we can see that, okay, well, if this investor chose a project with a loan term that was 5 years, then even though they could have been repaid earlier, then it's still not going to make it, because the money is going to remain invested under that term.
And that might delay it based upon senior lender documents, construction delays due to weather, supply chain issues, perhaps job creation issues, et cetera, right? So there are other factors that one needs to consider when analyzing these projects. So the timeline looks straightforward, but in reality it could be longer.
Yep, exactly. So obviously, since this is a new policy, there's going to be a lot of projects that are kind of trying to highlight a very short investment period, to kind of mirror this 2-year government requirement. What would you kind of advise clients who are considering a project that's promising a really short repayment period of just 2 to 3 years, and how does that
another investment? Look under the hood, do your due diligence, and determine for yourself whether the picture that perhaps a salesperson or a migration agent is depicting for you is in fact I want to say realistic.
Yep, exactly.
You need good advisors who are looking at this from afar, and don't have, how do I say this? Don't have any conflicts of interest, if you will, when looking at a particular project and are providing the best advice to you.
Yep, and I think one other kind of general point to mention there too is that the value of EB-5 capital coming into a project, it's much different if money's only going to be invested for 2 years versus 5 years, right? That money coming in has a much different value, and there's a lot fewer projects where there's enough value for money coming in just for 2 years to make it worth kind of going through all the headache, expense, and work to set up a project to accept EB-5 with a much shorter timeline. And when you have shorter timeline as well, you really need the money within a very defined period, and there's just more potential risk from a time perspective for things going just going smoothly, because it takes time for an investor to decide they want to do EB-5, hire an immigration attorney, do their source of funds, wire the funds, file their application. That whole process we see commonly takes anywhere from 3 or 4 months all the way up to a year, depending on where the funds are coming from. And if the project is only going to happen for 2 years, then by the time you get through that process or even start it, it could be a situation where the project couldn't meet the 2-year risk period because there's just not enough construction period left, to meet that requirement. So you've got to kind of be thinking about both your timing as an investor of being able to put the money in, but also from the project's, development timeline of when do they need the money and how long will they actually need money for, as part of your diligence.
And, we'll as well as just, I think that's a very practical point that you made, Sam. But well as the developer needs, right? Because if you're looking at a more substantial project, the likelihood is that construction phase is going to be more than just 2 years, and so you need to have that consideration in mind when you're doing your investment. The developer is going to have its needs as well, and there's a cost of money and a value to the money, as you indicated, and this is a significant cost usually for developers to do upfront this type of project. So they want to make sure that they're going to have the money at least to a period of time where they might be able to complete construction or at least get a stabilized project.
Yep, exactly. So we talked generally about most of these factors. These is kind of a little summary of key considerations. So as Bruce mentioned, we're not going to have exact answers on everything here, but we can kind of give you a sense of what are the major issues to be aware of when you're picking a project. So the start date of this 2-year period for the new policy, it's still a bit ambiguous. What is clear though is that repayment can't happen to an investor until jobs are created, right? The government wants to make sure that the jobs are created before money's no longer invested. That's pretty clear and not surprising. One that I do want to spend a little more time on is the 2-year investment time frame may be overturned. So Bruce, can you talk a little bit about that? What does that mean? What could that look like? What's going on there?
Yeah, I do agree with you. This is important to highlight for folks. The fact that there's this new guidance from the USCIS, it's not a rule. So it didn't go through the normal rulemaking process. That means that the guidance can be really changed by the USCIS almost at any time and for any reason. We actually have historical experience where that's happened in the past, where a court came and decided that a particular guidance was not something that the court thought was feasible, and the USCIS had to basically change its rules. So the fact that we have this 2-year investment time frame right now, we need to realize that is a risk in every project going forward, and that people need to consider that it may hold water during your investment time frame or it may not, and so it's nothing that is set in concrete at this point.
Got it. Okay. So EB-5 projects with shorter repayment terms may not have safety features. Yep. So again, just key to look at the project, historical execution timeline, jobs created, all of that's really important. And then the last point, which Bruce talked about earlier, is just the timing of the repayment is going to depend on what's in the offering documents and how the investment between the NCE and the JCE is ultimately structured, whether it's
I want to
loan,
add one other point
equity,
here too.
all of that.
Talking about the offering documents, Sam, there are going to be some projects that may have EB-5 investors already in from prior to March 22, right? So they're subject to the old rules, and they may still be out there raising capital from new investors under the new guidance. Those offering documents should be looked at. They probably need to be changed and updated to discuss the new sustainment term that we've been talking about. Perhaps add, risk factors regarding what the senior loan covenants may say regarding the repayment of the EB-5, or other matters that might impact the timing and delay related to the repayment of the capital to the investor.
Yep, got it. Okay, so to some general key considerations. Bruce, do you want to walk us through these?
Yeah. So here, do your research and use common sense. The first point, this is critical. Like I said, any investment, you want to do very thorough due diligence. And I would suggest that you do that due diligence with professionals that can help you really work through the maze of issues and understand the guidance and interpretation that's out there, because it could change daily, weekly, right? We want to understand the project's financial statements. We want to understand the history of success of the developer, the timeliness of projects perhaps that they've worked on and completed in the past, so on and so forth. So like any other investment, do your homework. As stated on this slide, if the deal sounds too good to be true, it probably is. We all have that experience as investors where promises are made by potential advisors or agents, and as it turns out that some of those promises aren't made. So do your homework, look at the documents, have your advisor look at loan documents, look at offering documents, look at construction timelines, and compare it with other projects to make sure that you're getting into a project that fits your individual needs as an investor, for you and your family, of course. Focus on underlying business success. As I indicated, we want to look under the hood and look at the success of the developer in the past. How many projects they've created? Have they done prior EB-5 projects? Have they been able to pay prior EB-5 investors back their money? So on and so forth, right? If at any point you're not sure about what's being promised to you, ask your advisors to help you. And if the risk level looks too high, obviously avoid it. As we mentioned now a couple of times, the repayment after exactly 2 years is probably unlikely because there are going to be other factors that come into play. So as part of your due diligence, make sure you drill down into what those phases look like so that you have a realistic understanding of when to expect the return of your capital.
Yep, great. And this is just a quick kind of guideline framework for investors with some of the key items to consider in terms of both immigration and financial aspects of a project, right? So how quickly are you going to get the green card, job creation, historical track record, success, investment term, risk of default, how long is the money invested for, target return. So these are kind of the 8 major factors that you want to try and make sure you've looked at. And it's, again, as Bruce mentioned, really important to work with an immigration attorney who really understands these and can help you identify questions and things to just understand before you make a decision. There's no right or wrong decisions, but there are fully informed and not fully informed decisions. And so having someone like Bruce to help you is going to make sure that you are at least fully informed and you don't pick something and you don't kind of know what you're getting into or what risk you're absorbing.
One other point that you make on this slide that I'd like to highlight for everybody, Sam, is that notwithstanding that you might look at a loan that says, hey, the term, the term of this loan is, whatever, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. Somebody needs to look at it and understand that a lot of those loan documents are going to have automatic extension periods. And so you're going to want to understand as an investor what those extension periods are, and who has control over, triggering the extension, so on and so forth.
Yep, exactly. Very good. So this kind of framework kind of dovetails into the next thing that we're going to talk about, which is a couple of different projects and kind of an overall grid of how we think about projects in today's space. Just looking at this framework, though, all of these things are important, but like many things in life, it's going to be very hard, if not impossible, to get every single one of these in the exact way that you want, right? There's always going to be pros and cons, right? If you want to drive a new Mercedes, well, you're going to have to pay more, right? And if you want to pay less, then you're going to be, driving a Toyota, but you're not going to have 15 airbags and a new Bose stereo in the car, right? So there's pros and cons. So, you've got to kind of decide, okay, which are the most important ones for me as an investor? Is it getting the green card as quickly as possible? Is it preserving the capital and making sure I get every penny back, even if it takes a little bit longer? Or is it, just getting as high of a return as possible? And maybe you're less sensitive to how long the money is going to be invested. So there's a number of different levers and issues to consider. And with that kind of idea, as an EB-5 regional center operator, our goal is to provide compelling options to a number of investors across the world. And we've kind of determined with this new RIA policy that just came out, recently about investment period, there's going to be investors who are going to be, more interested in a shorter investment period, but who may be willing to wait longer for the green card and maybe more interested in a higher return and vice versa. And so, what was true, 3 or 4 years ago, there was kind of a clearly defined, okay, this project is kind of, the best one overall because of all these factors. Now it's much more nuanced, and, the best investment project for a Canadian citizen who's living in the US is probably going to be a different best project for a family living in Shanghai in China, just because now investors get faster processing with rural projects and the ability to adjust status, which we didn't really talk about very much, but is important for investors already in the US. And so, just as a company, our goal is to offer a number of different compelling options. Some have a higher return, some have a shorter investment period, some are going to get you the green card faster, and to just very transparently make that information available to potential investors, and then let them do their homework and decide which aspects of the investment do they want to prioritize. And again, there's no right or wrong answer here, just fully informed and not fully informed. And that's why it's really important to do the research, ask the questions, come see the project, hire a knowledgeable attorney to help. And I'll just very quickly just spend a minute or two on two of the opportunities, just to kind of give an idea of what that contrast looks like. So one of the projects we have currently available is an urban EB-5 project. That's a loan that's in South Florida. It's being developed by Coulter, one of the top real estate developers in the Southeast. This project is actually a loan and equity, so we have both options. With respect to the equity, which is the more popular item, is a 5% annual return, which is a lot higher than what most other projects are offering. And the reason we can do that is because the project's in an urban area, so that means it's going to take a little bit longer for the green card because it doesn't have priority processing. The investment timeline is going to be a little bit shorter than many other projects. build, rent, and sell the project. And the project is just starting construction in early 2024. So a little bit earlier in the development timeline, but Coulter successfully executed on almost 200 projects with a 100% success rate over almost 30 years. So strong track record. But again, earlier on, not as many jobs, and the green card is going to take a little bit longer. In contrast, another project, also by Coulter, the same developer, is a Twin Lakes, is our Twin Lakes rural project outside Atlanta, Georgia. This project's much more advanced. Almost half of the homes are sold, thousands of jobs created already, and it does qualify for faster processing because it's in a rural TEA. So this project, the return is going to be lower, the investment period is going to be longer, but the investment safety is going to be higher because it's a guaranteed loan, not equity, and immigration risk is lower because all the jobs are already created for each investor. And this is a map just showing the number of these Coulter communities. This is one of 13, the one that is in a rural area. We've got a lot of videos and material on the website that you can check out. We're also doing an event with investors this coming March. And here are some photos of the project showing some of the recent construction. And we've got a bunch of testimonials as well on the website that you can listen to and hear investors explain, why this particular project was the one they chose. So with that, that's kind of the end of the formal slides for the presentation. I think, Bruce, could you share kind of a little bit about how you work with investors, who are considering doing an EB-5 investment, and if your involvement is limited only to the diligence side, or you can also help investors on the source of funds side as well, that would be helpful.
Yeah, no, so thank you. So our team here at Greenberg Trog is pretty extensive. We do both the corporate securities and loan agreement type of review for you. We also have a very large EB-5 immigration team here. We tend to work very closely with EB-5 investors before they put any capital in to assess and evaluate different projects they're looking at, go through the pros and cons of each project, make sure that the investor understands the risks up front before they end up picking and choosing a particular project. We then help them, of course, with their source and use analysis. We do extensive work with that prior to submitting a petition to USCIS. And the result of all that work that we do up front, of course, usually means that we don't have any issues and very little questions usually from USCIS once we submit the petition. So we're here to help. We have extensive experience. I've done hundreds of projects across the country. We've done probably tens of thousands of immigration investor petitions before the USCIS and have had great success with it thus far. We are actually pretty pleased with this new rule on sustainment period because we think it's going to really assist a lot of investors with an appetite to take a look at these projects going forward and measure, how this might be able to help, their families getting into the United States and at the same time get their capital repaid in a timely manner.
Great, perfect. And we've got Bruce's contact details on the screen here. So if you are considering making an investment or exploring EB-5, even if you're at an early stage, please feel free to reach out to him and he'll be able to help kind of advise you on both the source of funds side and also, if you're more advanced and you're kind of, deciding between one or two or three projects, he can definitely help, kind of give you a more detailed perspective on things you should be looking at across a number of projects. So thank you, Bruce. We really appreciate it. And
thank you, Steph, for inviting me.